Hey there, I'm Alex Kidman, and this is the Motorola Moto G15. Let's get into the review. But before I start, I've got to apologise. I do have a bit of a head cold, so my voice is not what it should be, and there may be a few more jump cuts in this review as a result of that. And if you've already watched my Moto G05 review, you know that the Moto G15 turned up at exactly the same time, and actually it's a fairly similar phone, just slightly more expensive, which should make it slightly more attractive. It should have slightly better features, and look, technically, yes, it does. Is it a more appealing phone? I'm not entirely sure that that's true. Let's get into why that is by first of all talking about the design. At its $229 asking price, the Motorola Moto G15 still sits within the budget space, and that means that there are still going to be compromises in terms of its overall design. Like its sibling, the G05, the Moto G15 runs from a 6.7-inch LCD display. Now, it does outdo the G05 in terms of straight screen resolution, packing in 2400 by 1080 pixels, making it properly full HD. But in return for that, you don't get the 90Hz refresh rate of the cheaper G05 model. This is a fixed 60Hz only phone, and that's something of a rarity for Motorola, because that's a company that's really pushed higher refresh rates even on its cheaper phones for some years now. I'm really not sure why they went down this path. Controls on the G15 sit on the right-hand side with standard volume buttons sitting above a combination power button and fingerprint reader. And look, that's very standard as a combination for a lot of budget phones right now. And here on the G15, it worked well enough during my testing. Not necessarily all that fast, but I didn't have too many instances where it went, no, can't read your fingerprint. It generally just unlocked for me first time, albeit again a little slowly. The Motorola Moto G15, as supplied to me, the Australian model I believe, was a dual nano SIM model. There's no eSIM at this price point as you'd expect, plus microSD, and that's a really nice combination to see. Does mean you have this very long SIM card tray to pop out, can be a little hard to pull out, but it's nice to see that kind of flexibility in the market because so many phones are going over to not offering microSD expansion at all. So I do like to see that. The models of the Moto G15 sold in Australia ship in Sunrise Orange, Gravity Grey and Iguana Green finishes. Looking around internationally, it appears that the G15 is also produced in tones called Sea Blue and Glacier Blue. I do love me a blue phone, so it's a little bit disappointing that we're not seeing those phones here. I also have to note, because I'm me, that the colour back on any model of the G15 comes with a vegan leather finish. And if you've watched any of my reviews, you know what's coming. I don't like the feel of a vegan leather, and I absolutely accept that this is a personal quirk kind of deal, but it is what it is. But thankfully, in the case and out of the box, it comes with a simple plastic case on it, which I'm just going to slip on it right now. Now, total fingerprint magnet, yes, but absolute lifesaver for me, also yes. Also, frankly, I like and encourage people to use phone cases. Sure, they add a bit of bulk, but they protect your phone. Whether it's a cheap phone or a premium phone, every phone deserves a case, in my view. Water resistance isn't usually a feature of most budget phones, and here Motorola slips back into its old habits, simply referring to the Motorola Moto G15 as water repellent, which is a term that doesn't necessarily mean all that much. I mean, unless you are building your smartphones out of sponges, they're going to be water repellent to some degree. What's odd here, though, is that according to Motorola Australia's spec sheets, the Motorola Moto G05 is water resistant. Now, it's only IP52, which is basically water repellent, but it has an IP rating and the G15 doesn't. And again, that's just kind of weird to me. The overall practical effect is probably about the same. Essentially speaking, if this phone gets rained on, it's probably going to survive as long as it's a relatively light rain shower. If you drop it in the toilet, drop it in the pool, no, you're going to kill it stone dead. Also, you're not really going to want to retrieve it from the toilet. But I digress. Basically, try to avoid getting this phone wet, but it's weird that it has a lesser level of water resistance, officially in a scientifically tested way, than the cheaper G05. The one area where the G15 does step up a fair bit is in camera terms. So the G15 swaps out the Moto G14's 50 megapixel wide, 2 megapixel macro sensors in favour of a 50 megapixel wide and 5 megapixel ultra wide sensor at the rear, while keeping an 8 megapixel sensor at the front for your selfie taking purposes. And look, yes, that does put it a step above the Moto G05 because that's a phone that has no ultra wide sensor on it at all. But look, we're still very much playing in the budget phone space here, so you absolutely must temper your expectations about what you're going to get out of this phone camera-wise. And look, in a glass half full kind of mood, what you can get out of even a cheap phone in 2025 can be quite good in good conditions. So the issue here is, while I love being able to choose between multiple lenses, when you push this phone in any kind of challenging condition, so fast action or low light, for example, it all quickly loses detail. It quickly becomes a bit substandard. At this price point, it would be amazing to get a zoom lens, and you don't get one. You just get a digital crop with a preset at 2 times and a maximum zoom rate of 6 times. So here's an example of me testing that out, just taking a photo of a seagull. Now, out wide, yeah, it's a fine enough photo, not particularly well composed, but that's not the point here. But I want to zoom in a bit. The 2 times, which is just your very basic crop, you could do that in an app, of course. Yeah, that's all right. But at 6 times, yeah, it's really struggling. It's not hard to see why Motorola opted to say this only goes up to 6 times, because even 6 times is starting to fall apart, and you probably don't want to even push it that far all that often. And look, ultimately, this is very much a phone built to a price point, and the cameras are always the first things to go on these budget phones in terms of quality. If you want a really good quality camera, you are still going to have to look into that mid-range or premium space to get it. In performance terms, like the Motorola Moto G05, the G15 is built around a MediaTek Helio G81 Extreme chipset with just 4GB of RAM and 128GB of onboard storage. The difference between the two phones there is just storage, so 64GB on the G05, 128GB on the G15. But the challenge here is one of performance, and especially with just 4GB of RAM. So to test that out at a synthetic level, I put the G15 through Geekbench 6's CPU test, comparing it against similarly priced handsets as well as its immediate predecessor. Here's how it compares. Now, the difference here between the G15 and the G05 isn't all that surprising given their inherent similarities, but it's not a good state of affairs when the more expensive phone can't beat either the cheaper model or even its immediate predecessor in performance terms. I'd never expect some huge, 4 or 5 times leap in performance because we're still talking budget phones, but they absolutely should get better year on year, not regress in performance terms. The switch from the T616 found in the G14 to the MediaTek processor found in the G15 does show what I'd expect in performance boost terms a little bit better if you look at GPU performance via 3D Mark. Again though, it's hard to look at those figures and not figure that within this price bracket, the Moto G05 isn't the better buy. Yeah, it's got less internal storage on board, but the price difference could rather easily buy a microSD card to cover that gap with change to spare. What all of this boils down to is that in day-to-day usage, the Moto G15 is not a particularly fast phone. Now, that's again a very common story for budget phones, but I guess that will also come down to what your needs are. If your needs are only basic, then this could be a suitable model, especially as, for example, it's NFC capable, so it can handle some NFC-based transactions. Might be good, potentially speaking, for your mobile banking. I will say I've not tested it that way, but in theory, the capability is there. The Motorola Moto G15 runs Android 15, but in terms of updates, that's all it's ever going to run, with Motorola stating outright that it's not getting any Android updates at all. You do at least get 2 years of security updates to keep it current, and I do appreciate that Motorola at least has been upfront. So many of these budget phones just hit the market and they never say anything about updates, or they just say, oh, we'll advise on that when updates come through, and then they just don't. typically speaking. So at least they're being honest up front, but I don't love that this is not getting some level of OS upgrade. And that's not just I want new features on a very cheap phone. That's perhaps a little unrealistic, or perhaps they wouldn't run that well. It's more to do with just staying current with the everyday apps that a lot of the users of these phones are going to want or need, because it is more likely, because of the lack of updates, that at a certain point you might have a technically functional phone that can't run the apps you want it to run because they have been updated and now insist on a certain security level, for example. The Motorola Moto G15 also installs a number of apps by default that you may or may not want. I'm no longer at all surprised to see Booking.com's app pre-installed on any Android phone, or for that matter TikTok, because clearly money changes hands there. The slew of incredibly generic Android games that ship on the Moto G15 aren't particularly welcome either, but you can uninstall them, and my absolute advice would be, just do that unless they thrill you, and if they thrill you, that's cool too, but I think there are better games out there. You do at least get Moto Actions built into the Moto G15. So, for example, I can chop it twice here and the light will come on. And in theory, I can twist it and the camera will come on. But as you can see, in fact, the light has just decided to come on. My one problem with this is a feature, actually, that the G15 has that the G05 doesn't have, namely being able to launch the camera with a double twisting action. But I'm sitting here twisting it and it's only just come on in my hand. It takes a bit more work than I would really like, and it's honestly a little bit easier to launch it via its actual button that way rather than the Moto Action. Other Motorola phones will tend to do that a little bit more slickly. I'm guessing that's just down to the processor actually having to chug through the command itself. The Motorola Moto G15 packs in a 5,200 mAh battery, the same thing that the G05 does. They're very clearly built on the same architecture, and that's slightly more than you get on your typical Android phone these days. Most of those have 5,000 mAh batteries, and every single manufacturer will talk about how their batteries are big, but here Motorola may have a point. I mean, they're bigger at least, but of course, it's not the size that counts, it's what you can actually do with it. And here I turn to my standard YouTube 3-hour battery test. So here's how the Motorola Moto G15 compares against those other similarly priced phones in that test. And look, that's quite pleasing battery life, just sneaking past the G05 for the first hour of tested performance, though slipping behind it in the second and third hours. It's notable here, however, that the G15 was running the full 1080p version of the video test file, where the G05 got to kind of play it a bit lighter with the 720p stream, owing to its lower display resolution. What this does boil down to is a phone with decent all-day performance for most users, and I'd argue, for most users, it's going to have more than enough power to get them through what needs to be done before being dropped onto a charger. However, here you will have to supply the charger yourself, because there isn't one in the very thin box, just a USB-C to USB-C cable. At least for the Australian box. Again, Motorola can do some weird things in different markets, and there may be a model that comes with a charger. The Australian model certainly doesn't. Motorola was one of the last companies to particularly put a standard charger in many budget phone boxes, but it shifted over to this model of just providing a cable. And look, if you've already got a USB-C charger to hand, great, you're set, you're ready to go. If you don't, you're going to have to budget for one, and I'm going to put the same bit of advice that I put in my Moto G05 review, which is, please buy a reputable brand charger. Don't just buy something dodgy down the markets or something cheap that you saw on Temu or AliExpress or whatever, because so many chargers out there are built really poorly to a very cheap standard, and they are electrically dangerous. People have actually died as a result of using cheap mobile phone chargers, and your life's just not worth that risk. So should you buy the Motorola Moto G15? Well, look, if it existed in isolation as Motorola's budget model for Australia, it'd be a fair offering. Maybe not the most exciting phone, but certainly not a bad phone. And I'm not saying that it is a bad phone, especially considering its battery endurance. However, that's not the story here. This is a phone that costs more than the Motorola Moto G05, while being essentially identical at a performance level. You do get a sharper screen, but at a lower refresh rate and with outstated IP tested water resistant. It's also beaten out by the phone it's replacing in straight-line CPU performance terms, which is just plain weird because newer phones should by definition be better, not worse. And all of this leaves the Moto G15 in an awkward position because, well, again, I'm not saying that this is a bad phone. I do struggle to come up with a reason why you might want to buy one when Motorola itself has better options available for less money. That leaves this as a phone that's best purchased at a discount. A couple of months from now, when the price on this thing drops, maybe it'll be worth buying for that slightly nicer screen if the refresh rate doesn't matter to you. But right now at launch, yeah, this one's a bit of a hard pass from me.